Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear speakers, it's a pleasure to welcome you in this second part of the panel. I would like to thank you, the audience, for attending this second part. I also want to join the thanks to the Kazakh government for convening this forum, for the organization, and for the very skillful hosting. We really appreciate that. And of course, I would like to thank the distinguished experts who traveled here to Nur Sultan in order to bring their views into this important topic that we have today, the future of the multilateral trading system. We have heard that this morning, this afternoon. I think that if so many people gathered here, including you, all of us, it's because we all are optimistic, but everyone with a personal touch. Then I will introduce this panel of very distinguished and optimistic experts. Starting on your right, first we have Professor Ernst Ulrich Petersmann. He is Emeritus Professor in International Law at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Welcome with us. Second, Mr. Maxim Medvedkov. He is the head of the Trade Policy Department at the National University Higher School of Economics, Russian Federation. Third, we have Mr. Daniel Crosby, partner with King & Spalding, LLC, and managing the Geneva office. Thank you, Daniel, for coming. Next is Mr. Khalil Hamdani, visiting professor at the Lahore School of Economics in Pakistan. Next one is Mr. Abdelhamid Mamdou, senior counsel with King & Spalding in Geneva. And last but not least, Robert McDougall, director and principal at Cadence Global Limited. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to you, we will dive deeper in all the amazing, the fascinating issues, questions, problems, challenges that have been raised this morning, this afternoon. We will go further into these issues under a variety of aspects because we are very lucky, dear audience, to have a very varied set of panelists covering all the array, academia, former negotiators, the business community, and this will allow to really complete this important session with a very broad view on those topics. I will start, of course, with Mr. Professor Ernst Ulrich Petersmann. You have been working for the Trade Department at the German Ministry of Economy a long time ago. You have been professor in many very renowned universities, at present the European University Institute in Florence. You came here bringing with you the sunshine and the blue sky of Florence. Thank you for that, but we want more. And we are looking forward to your enlightening remarks on the public international law aspects of all the issues that have been raised today. Only that in 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and let me also start by thanking the organizers of this conference for having invited me to this very visionary city and to this fascinating conference. So Paul Romer mentioned in his morning speech the disagreement among governments on the role of the state, of the government in the economy. And I think this is the biggest challenge to the WTO now, that we have three conflicting visions. The first vision is the American neoliberalism, which has dominated the evolution of GATT and the WTO for 70 years, but which is driven by interest group politics, and which is also shaped by this fiction of the minimal role of the state. And this is in conflict, clearly, with the different vision, which we see the Chinese state capitalism, a totalitarian approach with regard to economic regulation, and thirdly, the European paradigm of what we call ordoliberalism in Europe. That is, the European Union emphasizes the need for additional multilateral WTO disciplines on market failure and governance failures. So here, the American strategy seems to be to destroy the appellate body system in order to increase bargaining power for renegotiating the trade remedy rules and for renegotiating market access to other WTO members. But this strategy is highly problematical. I have served as the secretary of the Uruguay Round negotiating group, which negotiated the dispute settlement understanding, DSU, and I will therefore focus my comments on the 5 options which WTO members have to respond to this American strategy of destroying the appellate body system. So the first option, of course, is and remains to continue negotiating DSU reforms. But I think we have to be honest, and we have to recall that these DSU reform negotiations have started in 1998, and they have never produced precise results. The current DSU reforms are even much more less likely to be successful at least for 3 reasons. The first reason is that the US claim of judicial overreach of the appellate body is clearly wrong. It's based on wrong facts, but unfortunately in the DSB, hardly any WTO member defends the appellate body against this wrong legal claim. The second reason is that the US interpretations of Article 17 DSU are clearly neglecting the customary rules of treaty interpretation. Again, unfortunately, hardly any WTO member in the DSB defends the appellate body, and here arguably the appellate body interpretations have been justified by the customary rules of treaty interpretation and by the quasi-judicial mandate of the appellate body to settle disputes promptly, to administer justice. So the third reason is that for the US interest groups driving this blockage of the appellate body system, the objective is not to reform the appellate body. It's certainly not to strengthen the appellate body. It is to get rid of the appellate body jurisprudence on trade remedies and to use the appellate body as a bargaining chip in the end game on how to reform the WTO. So here I think, unfortunately, it would be desirable to improve the DSU rules. Article 17 DSU has been an afterthought, has been poorly drafted, and certainly needs to be improved. But I think the current DSU negotiations will not successfully conclude. The second response by WTO members should be to respect the rule of law, to respect the democratic mandate given by parliaments to improve and modernize the WTO, not to destroy the WTO legal system. And here I think WTO members forget that Article 3 of the WTO agreement prescribes separation of powers. So the political function of the WTO, the negotiating function, has always been subject to consensus-based practices. But the administrative functions and the judicial functions have always been subject, in the WTO at least, to majority voting. Article 9, paragraph 1 of the WTO agreement prescribes the filling of the WTO appellate body vacancies on the basis of majority voting. And I think here WTO ambassadors should comply with their mandate, and this is in conformity with the GATT practice. Article 25 GATT prescribes also the principle of majority voting, even if it has hardly ever been used in GATT practice, but it has been quite often threatened in GATT practice. And allowing the US to destroy the appellate body system as a bargaining chip for renegotiating the WTO trade remedy rules is, in my view, as an outside citizen, an irresponsible diplomacy. The third response by WTO members is illustrated by the very large use of WTO dispute settlement proceedings challenging the discriminatory US tariffs on steel, aluminum, and on other products. This is to be welcomed, but you should not forget none of these panel proceedings is likely to lead to the adoption of a panel report, because all these proceedings can be blocked by the United States as of next year when the appellate body is no longer functional, and then Article 16 of the DSU says the panel report will not be adopted if appealed, and if the appeal does not produce an appellate report, none of these panel proceedings is likely to lead to a legally binding dispute settlement ruling. So the fourth response of WTO members is, of course, this mystic pragmatism. We are all pragmatic, and we don't need a judicial system. But this pragmatism that if the appellate body breaks down this year, by the end of the year, that then the panel system will continue to function, that the arbitration system can become a substitute for appellate review. This is based on a lot of fantasies, and I think we should be much more realistic. And finally, the fifth response is to have conferences inviting civil society, inviting also democratic institutions for holding WTO power politics accountable. But unfortunately, I think here I doubt whether this will very much impress WTO diplomats. So here I think, let me conclude by appealing to trade politicians to respect the limited democratic mandate which have been given by parliaments when they approved the WTO agreement. Also, the US president has no mandate to destroy the WTO legal system. And the mandate is to improve and to modernize, but not to destroy. And let me also mention my view that I think the European experience of 70 years of European integration have made Europe not only more economically prosperous than ever before, but the most important result has been 70 years of democratic peace, of a rule of law system, of fundamental rights and human rights protected by European law. And here I think it would be a tragedy if the WTO agreement, as the most important worldwide agreement for promoting economic welfare, for promoting transnational rule of law, for promoting sustainable development, would be destroyed by irresponsible WTO power politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I move on to you, Maxime. Before having your present position, you were a formidable negotiator. I'm afraid I couldn't say how many negotiations Maxime concluded, but I don't care because I would not be surprised you don't know either. But one I remember, it was the successful accession of Russia to the WTO. So with such an impressive background, I think we count on you to tell us about the way forward in the WTO, some trade issues that in your view should be addressed, and also a few trade rules that may be improved. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. My privilege today is, for the first time, I can speak what I think, like Mark, and I will do it. I think WTO has much more challenges as compared with we discussed today, and it's certainly not only a crisis of dispute settlement system. In my hierarchy, there may be placed as follows. First, trade policy is back in foreign policy. It's extremely bad thing. Countries resisted that after the Second World War, but unfortunately what we see now, again, foreign policy is sometimes equal to trade policy. So that something should be done on that. Second, countries come back to, some countries come back to old trade rule, which was called in the European Union at some point effective reciprocity. It was old times when socialist countries joined the GATT, and because the tariff meant nothing in their trade policies, they committed to increase imports. So if we look at what is discussed between the US and some other countries now, it reminds me on that old effective reciprocity principle. But what is wrong with that? The wrong is that result of these deals probably will not be in line with WTO rules. And that creates another big mine for the organization. We have no understanding how to treat this, but I think we have to take this into account. The third differences, the third news in world trade are connected with its structure. More and more structure is determined by blockchains, by artificial intelligence, by other new things. And that means that old instruments are not applicable. For example, in Geneva, during public days was demonstration of artificial intelligence negotiator. The question is how this negotiator, if he negotiates this artificial negotiator, negotiates something, what we will do with intellectual property. And there are many, many questions of that kind which nobody looks at yet. Now, if we go to other topic, other problem which is connected with production chains. My university calculated the share of production chains in world trade at the level of 70%, which is extremely high, and it's continued. It increases at yearly basis, but in order to get access to supply chain, the import tariff does not matter. Market access commitments in services does not matter as well, because there are other rules which are connected, which are informal and which are connected mostly with ownership of technology. The companies who own technology and who own the blockchain, the supply chain, they determine the rules of access, and WTO is not dealing with that yet. And it means that if this 70% figure will increase, current market access negotiations will probably make less sense, and we will have to think about other negotiations on other topics. If the governments will not do it, these rules will be continuously created by monopolies. And that will certainly harm international trade and economies. We have also some outstanding issues from current rules. We fully agree, Russian experts fully agreed with the view that subsidies, specifically harmful subsidies, should be eliminated through development of new rules, through expansion of subsidy agreement. That goes without saying, however, we have other kind of subsidies which also develop a lot of harm for competition. For example, cost of money. So we know some capitals when you can lend money for price which is below zero. and asked me whether it's a subsidy, and of course it's a subsidy which unfortunately is not countervailable. However, it's about not one company, it's about all companies in the country or even in the region which enjoy this access to cheap money, and certainly it's unfair. If it's unfair, so something should be done on that. State trading, it's another topic which we always shared. We have to develop rules on state trading. However, if we think a little bit constructively on this issue, look what transnational companies are doing. What's the difference between transnationals and state trading companies? Transnational has same kind of privileges like state trading, the same access to regulatory bodies and to some preferences, and we see that through enormous economic power, activity of some transnational companies creates even more harm than state trading. So I complete my set remarks, but I'm absolutely persuaded that we anyway have no way out. We have no alternative to WTO, and the colleague said today, we have just to inject a little bit more into activity of that organization. Thank you.
Many thanks, Maxime. And I confirm, I prefer to hear what you really think. I retaliate at dinner telling you what I really think, but this is not for the public. I pass now to you, Daniel. Well, you have a formidable background, in your case, in business. You have been working for major companies, and now you are doing a great job coordinating those companies. Therefore, we are very interested to hear your view on private business involvement in the multilateral trading system. And I think particularly issues like e-commerce and trade facilitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian, and thank you for all the organizers. It's really wonderful to be here for my first time in Nur-Sultan, not my first time in Astana or Kazakhstan. I would like to speak to the issue of systemic challenges, but from the view of the private sector and private users of the system, and with the introductory sort of comment from my perspective that the rules were written for the benefit of the private sector with state interests in mind of efficient allocation of resources among the members, but really what we're talking about here is writing rules for business to operate internationally. So why, there's two questions. Why do these rules matter for businesses? And why the problems facing the system are more challenging than we think. And I think that's what Maxime started off by saying. There's a lot going on here. And before I get into my prepared presentation, I'd just like to respond to Professor Petersman one point that I will not defend the tactics of the United States, but I will provide an alternative view of the two kind of fundamental premises of Professor Petersman's intervention, and that is one that the U.S. wants to destroy the appellate body, which I submit to you is untrue, and that the appellate body has done no wrong and should be defended as such. And I don't think that either one of those premises are true, and I'll go through some of those issues in my presentation. So why are those rules important? So for the huge number of businesses that are out there, in Kazakhstan and Russia and the United States and EU and everywhere, when they trade internationally, the international rule of law is absolutely required. My clients are not going to do business without international rule of law, and the WTO is currently the only structure that provides that rule of law internationally in an enforceable way. Now, but going back to Paul Romer's observation, and I think a lot of us have picked up on that, and I think that's significant in itself, that we are operating in a fiction of convergence. And businesses cannot operate in a fiction. Businesses need rule of law, and they need to know what's coming. And if they're operating in a fiction, it means there's a falsehood, something that they can't foresee and can't enforce. And I would say that that is absolutely true, that there is a fiction, that there is as everyone has said so far, a clash of systems where that clash creates expectations from businesses and from governments that are misplaced, which is kind of what comes about from fiction. And I would say the second thing that Dr. Romer said that I thought was important is the failure, he pointed out the failure of fact-based decision-making, which is an underpinning of the rule of law by governments, and his suggestion that the rule of law might not be valued, that countries don't see that rule having a value. So I think these observations are really important from the business perspective, because when businesses operate in these environments, and I'm talking about business collectively, some businesses win and some lose. And that's what's supposed to happen in this system by competition. But when the losers lose based on a misplaced or a misplaced perception or expectation, then that causes political problems in addition to economic displacement. So I would say that of these three pillars that we're talking about in the system, the one kind of good example I think that Mark mentioned earlier on trade facilitation, the reason that shows us that a sector-specific multilateral approach can be achieved by this system that we all work in. So it's not impossible, but it started in what year? With the Colorado group, 1996, and it just kind of finished recently. So it's a long-term thing, and although we kind of appreciate Kazakhstan's commitment to solve all the problems by the next ministerial conference next June, we know that this is a long-term thing. So let's commit to solving that problem long-term. The other example of that that's going on right now, as Professor Ihara, I think, focused on, because they're one of the co-conveners in this group, is e-commerce. Another area that broke this kind of tradition of throwing all the negotiations in one pot, having to do everything at once. This is a particular sector with lots of issues and interests going on, but really advancing this week, having the first substantive negotiations. But I would just offer you from the business perspective, again, that first problem of the fiction needs to be solved, because if we have three kind of views of the biggest issue in that negotiation is what do we do with data? Can data even move? We have the United States with its neoliberal approach saying, of course, data has to move and there should be no regulation unless by contract. We have the EU that says data should move, but only if it's according to my rules and not subject to international dispute settlement. And then China saying, we're not ready for any rules on data. So the expectations of companies and governments are very, very different along these lines. And I don't see a successful kind of agreed solution to the negotiation unless we iron out that first issue of the fiction that we have all agreed on a common way that governments should regulate their economies and businesses internationally and domestically. I'll wrap up by saying that when I think Niall on the previous panel mentioned that if dispute settlement withers, the rules wither. But I would turn that around as well to give you a different perspective and say if the rules wither, dispute settlements withers. And I would say that applies across the board, but particularly on the issues of trade remedies that Professor Petersman was talking about, that at least in my view, there's been a fundamental problem created by the appellate body's approach to trade remedies, whether you like trade remedies or don't like trade remedies is not the issue. It's what's in the text and how it's applied and interpreted as a fundamental issue of ceding sovereignty to an international organization and to a treaty system, which is then not followed, creates massive problems, again, maybe arising from a difference in governance approaches, but still it exists. And I don't think the solution, at least the intended solution of the United States, is to crush the system. It's just to go back to what they think they agreed. And so if we can kind of reset our minds around that possibility that maybe the United States wants to go back and figure out a way, although it's difficult, that's what the private sector wants. And the United States is under pressure from its private sector to have a rules-based system where these things are settled internationally and not just according to, you know, the strong man approach in the world. So I think that's an ally that everyone in this room who believes in the multilateral system and the rules-based system has business as an ally, and we'll certainly be working over the next year, or certainly to December and then to the next ministerial conference, to make sure that these business issues turn out successfully. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Clearly, business is expecting this process to deliver, and to deliver by MC12. And we have all to remain convinced that this will be done and that the results will be meaningful, of course. I move on now to you, Khalid. Before joining academia, you have been a civil servant in the UN system. So you are very experienced in terms of systems. I understood that the topic which is close to your heart is investment facilitation. And we are very interested that you share your views on this topic with us. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I want to talk about investment facilitation, but also to preface it a bit with a development perspective, and particularly from developing countries from where I come from, which is Pakistan, although I'm not a delegate to the WTO, so I will be speaking as an academic. You know, developing countries and investment facilitation has been put forward as an issue to the WTO largely by developing countries. And I think it is important to recognize at the outset that developing countries see trade and investment as being good for our growth and development. It is true that we protect jealously our policy space. However, the policy space and sovereignty issues is not unique to developing countries. It's, we've always protected, argued in favor of free trade, but being fair trade. And it's interesting that these days, fair trade is an issue also being raised by some developed countries. Paradoxically, while developing countries have been liberalizing their foreign investment frameworks, developing countries have begun to screen and regulate foreign investment, not just in the Americas, also in Europe. Now, the multilateral trading system has to accommodate these policy shifts, their positions, and the question of flexibility was raised in the first part of the panel here in this session. And I think this is flexibility is a good thing, but it should be done in ways that benefit all partners, large and small countries. The question of systemic challenges. I think it's worth recalling that in the 1960s, developing countries feared foreign enterprise as being a challenge to our sovereignty. But in the 70s, the Europeans feared American multinationals. And in the 1990s, Americans feared Japanese takeovers of their Rockefeller Plaza, Sony, and other enterprises. Today, there's wide fear of Chinese capital. But in all these circumstances, the core issue is not so much national versus foreign. It is rather about the evolution of the international division of labor and the adjustment of policy regimes to the advancement of economies. And as developing countries become larger and want to participate more actively in the multilateral trading system, there is need to accommodate that. This is a sensitive issue, and it provokes a nationalistic response, but it deserves a multilateral approach. Now, it is true that the systemic challenges are being felt in the trade realm, and therefore the trade tensions are putting the WTO through a twist, okay? And there are talk of reforms, and reform is important for all institutions. I worked in the UN for 29 years, and therefore we know what it means when they talk about reform. But it's important to see reform in terms of the future and not in terms of current challenges. And when we do tackle reform, it should be done collectively and not at the dictate of the powerful. The era of the green room negotiations is past. We don't want to return to that. Now, I would imagine by next year, when we have the ministerial here in Kazakhstan, in Astana, the current tensions will have subsided, hopefully. Even so, the exercise cannot be business as usual. The Doha issues, which developing countries have pushed for many years, are important, but the context in which these issues were framed has faded. The development objective needs to be addressed anew in the emerging areas of electronic commerce, small enterprises, and investment facilitation. In these emerging areas, the potential for trade creation and sustainable development is substantial. Investment facilitation is one area where the WTO should ensure that trade rules are relevant for the current realities. Investment is critical for trade. Investment stimulates exports. It diversifies industrial structure. It provides entry into world markets. Integrated international production is a dominant feature of world trade. However, participation in global value chains demands a world-class business environment. And for this, investment facilitation is a natural complement to trade facilitation. In fact, investment facilitation enables developing countries to benefit from the full potential of the trade facilitation agreement. Now, the WTO structured dialogues have clarified that investment facilitation is a downstream activity. It is distinct from upstream policy formulation. Investment facilitation does not encroach on policy space or the sovereign right to govern. Investment facilitation instead concerns application of policies in practice. This includes regulatory transparency, which involves clear presentation and consistent application of rules and policies. It also includes a streamlining of administrative processes, which involves simplifying and standardizing documentation requirements and tracking timely completion of screening and approval procedures. Now, all this may seem obvious and mundane, but the fact is that in the last 10 years, all the positive steps that have been taken to attract investment, only 10% of the measures relate to investment facilitation. This is a blind spot that needs to be addressed. Investment facilitation also involves stakeholder engagement. This can be a channel for informal dispute prevention and for exploring opportunities for sequential investment. It may include monitoring impacts of vulnerable groups and on fragile ecosystems, and also for identifying partnership opportunities. Bringing together local producers, foreign investors, institutions, public sector, private sector, and engaging them in building local linkages. Such engagement is particularly important as the investment needed to attain sustainable development goals are different from the past. There are other elements that deserve consideration as well, including facilitation measures by the home countries of investors, the sharing of practices for responsible investment, and more focused technical assistance capacity building by international agencies and donor organizations. Now, in the last 2 years, the investment community and international agencies have participated actively in the WTO structured dialogues. The next ministerial conference is well positioned to advance this work. The roadmap should follow the successful model of trade facilitation. That exercise was focused, open-ended, inclusive, and allowed for individual country implementation capacity and relevant technical assistance. In this respect, the overall aim should be to create the counterpart to the trade facilitation agreement, namely an investment facilitation agreement. In this way, trade and investment can be complementary drivers for growth and development, particularly for the least developed and landlocked countries. We know that there are preferential trading schemes have attracted investment in Africa, but much of that investment has come in the garment industry. What is needed is sequential investment in more value-added activities, and here investment facilitation can play a role, not only in the host country, but also in alleviating saturated world markets for apparel exports. It's a win-win. In the landlocked economies, including much of Central Asia, we heard this morning how important investment enables trade with the rest of the world. There's need for hard infrastructure for connectivity. There's also need for soft investment facilitation and trade facilitation measures to ensure that transport corridors become viable economic corridors, not just endpoints for transit routes, but activity throughout those routes. In South Asia, to give you another example, Bangladesh has major energy investments in Bhutan and plans to invest in Nepal for the import of electricity. These plans and broader regional trade and investment are contingent on establishing efficient cross-border infrastructure and transit arrangements. So again, trade facilitation and investment facilitation go hand in hand, and they promote regional trade and regional development. And if it happens, it would expedite the graduation of 3 least developed countries. Of course, progress ultimately depends on national efforts, but an investment facilitation framework can provide a helpful boost, and it will help make the multilateral trading system most central to the advance of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalid, for carrying into this panel the important developing country perspectives. Let's hope that the United Nations experience in reforming itself will help the WTO being very efficient at reforming. We all took note of your proposal to change the painting and the color of the green room, maybe to make it like this wall, with a view to have our ambassadors even more optimistic than they used to be. I move now to you, Hamid. You told me you wanted to inspire us and to elaborate on some legal provisions. You have been so skillful doing that in front of the Services Council so many times when you were the director of the Services and Investment Division, that I trust we will all be very eager to hear your convincing views regarding your selected legal provisions. Please, Hamid, go on.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for the introduction. I'm not sure about inspiration, but first of all, before I start, let me thank the organizers for inviting me here. This is my second time in this city. I came to Astana a bit more than a year ago to talk about investment facilitation, and I'm truly delighted to come once again to Nur Sultan. Now, in 5 minutes, I will just try to paint a picture which would actually give a diagnostic view of where we are, and then just make some suggestive comments about 2 specific challenges. Now, the composure of the WTO is being challenged, and in looking at the reasons behind this, we heard a lot this morning, but I would make a distinction between what I would consider the phenomena, the overall phenomena that actually affect each and every reform file, the forces of nature that are facing the system, and distinguish that from the specific files, whether we're talking about dispute settlement, appellate body, reforming the negotiating function, the regular functions, notifications, and so on. But I've identified 3 important phenomena, really. First and most obvious is the leadership deficit, which is huge. And Mark Linscott talked about this, as well as others this morning. I think this is a tremendous challenge that needs to be overcome. And we have been used to a certain type of leadership. We've been spoiled by it for so many years. Now the world is changing, but leadership actually can take different forms. Leadership can actually take group forms. Leadership can be in taking initiatives like the current initiatives on e-commerce and investment facilitation and domestic regulation. That's the first phenomena, and the system would need to adjust to the new situation and come up with leadership arrangements that would propel the system forward. The second, which I want you to bear with me because it is quite challenging, it is the increasing complexity of trade policy issues that are facing trade negotiators and trade policymakers, and even the drafters of new trade agreements. That complexity we see in a very clear way in issues relating to the digital economy and digital trade. And without getting into a very technical level, there is this interface always between trade liberalization on one side and opening markets and legislation and regulation for objective and legitimate reasons, whether it's for privacy, cybersecurity, consumer protection, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, we have been dealing with this interface all along in merchandise trade, by trying to ensure least trade restrictiveness. But for trade negotiators to have disciplines that ensure the least trade restrictiveness of regulation, we need to have different kinds of discussions that bring together different constituencies, even at the local government level, between trade negotiators, regulators, even sometimes law enforcement experts, to see how legitimate concerns can be addressed in the least trade restrictive manner. And in this kind of a process, the WTO needs to have different kinds of discussions, a bit more deep and a little more granular. And I would suggest that members should use the WTO Secretariat more actively as a source of knowledge and expertise in that exercise. The third phenomena, I think, is of a political nature. And that's the common purpose of the system as it was created is no longer common. And excuse my political incorrectness, but there is now a segment of the membership who do not see the purpose of the system the same way it has been seen when the system was created almost 25 years ago. That is a reality, and it is their sovereign right. But the question is, what do we do about this? We will have to operate in ways that does not impose on them decisions that they don't want to be part of, but at the same time allow others to move forward. Here I will make specific comments about two of the specific challenges: the negotiating function and the special and differential treatment, the treatment of developing countries. On the negotiating function, we have been stuck, and I think this is perhaps one of the biggest problems that are facing the system. If you look at the WTO system as a legal system, there is always a balance between the rulemaking function and then the adjudicatory function. If I may sort of say the legislative function and the judiciary function. The legislative function in the WTO has broken down for the past 20 years, with the exception of trade facilitation. Now, it is natural that the pressure on the judiciary function would rise to the point that we see today. Why? Because the legislative function is not just about introducing new rules, it's also about clarifying existing rules, giving guidance to the implementation of agreements. There is a provision about issuing authoritative interpretations in the WTO agreement. It has not been used once throughout the past 24 years. So looking at the negotiating function, what do we see? In my view, there is a need to clarify what we mean by plurilaterals. Those joint initiatives launched at Buenos Aires were subject to a lot of attack because they were seen as anti-multilateral. Well, as a matter of fact, there's nothing new about launching plurilateral processes. And when we talk about plurilaterals, that's a very confusing term. Here, I think we need to distinguish between processes and outcomes. Nobody is talking necessarily about a plurilateral outcome, but a plurilateral process that engages a subset of the membership is nothing new at all for the past 70 years. So if we clarify that and try to move forward, I think this could help even developing countries to a very large extent, whereby those who don't wish to be part of a process don't need to be part of it. At the same time, those who want to move forward would move forward. The outcomes are presumed to be MFN. Whether a negotiating initiative will succeed or not, that's a different question. But we need to have the process starting. The second issue that I would comment on is special and differential treatment. And here I would refer to the experience we had during the drafting of the services agreement in the Uruguay round, because we faced exactly the same situation that we're facing today. The disenchantment with the special and differential treatment, which is a one-size-fits-all, and it's exonerating from treaty burdens. Now, we started with the sense of purpose. Why are developing countries in the system? The presumption is that because trade is good for development and more trade is better. So what is the purpose of special and differential treatment? The purpose is to enable developing countries. It's not to exonerate. How do you enable developing countries? You give them the flexibility that they need, but it needs to be customized, not a one-size-fits-all. And at the same time, look at the tools that would enable developing countries. And here I will point at the Trade Facilitation Agreement and the excellent example of linking assistance with the implementation of regulatory reforms. We need to have more of that. But for developing countries to move forward, they need actually to look at their own interest and see how to pursue it and how to negotiate collectively. And perhaps, engage in joint initiatives similar to the ones that we have today, but on issues and areas of interest to developing countries. I would stress here that a relationship between developed and developing countries that is based on the presumption that the protection of policy space is absolute to the point that engaging in a negotiation means that as a developing country, I would sit at the negotiating table and expect that I would conclude the negotiations with zero impact on my policy space is never a realistic assumption in any trade negotiations. There has to be a give and take. Now, of course, the flexibility would need to be respected, and the choices also would need to be respected. Just to wind up now, my final point, I come back full circle to where do we start if we want to look at corrective courses of action? I think the negotiating function really is where we need to start. And here I don't mean just market access negotiations, but the negotiating function in general in terms of a problem-solving approach that would actually look at the individual files that we have in front of us, keeping in mind the three phenomena that cut across everything, which is the leadership deficit, the complexity, and the diversity of purposes among developing countries. And with that, I would hope that MC12 would be an important milestone and a huge step forward. But I would not see it as the destination. I think it's a long-term process, and we've heard earlier examples to the timeline that we should aspire to. And let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I move now to you, Bob. You had 4 points in mind: development, in particular S&D, special and differentiated treatment, dispute settlement, and rules. We were almost on time, but now I think you have officially 2 minutes left. Well, let's extend a little bit. It also means that we will not have any questions. You have the floor. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Christian. And thanks for that triple challenge of trying to say something novel as the 13th speaker, doing it in less time and standing between the audience and the coffee break. So I think I'll take out a couple of my points and focus on some that may not have been raised. Obviously, my first point actually has been raised, and it's on the question of models of development. And it started out early on in the plenary already with Romer's reference to the economic fiction. Because obviously, as others have said, that a lot of the current tensions are grounded in the dichotomy between markets and non-market economies. And the U.S. and China are certainly on the extremes of this equation. But China obviously has many market features, and the U.S. Obviously has various degrees of state intervention, and many of its economic successes originally started with significant state involvement. And most economies are somewhere in between. How are we going to try to get beyond this fiction? And certainly it'll be better than having the U.S. and China continue to fight over the model and engage in the mutually assured destruction of value that we're witnessing right now. To accomplish this, we might have to focus a little bit more, less on trying to converge towards a single model and more working on mechanisms for ensuring neutrality of competition between diverse and acceptable diverse models. And this might include more explicit flexibility for state involvement in the economy, but in exchange for that, we'd have to have a much greater commitment to transparency around this involvement, a greater commitment to the rule of law, to make sure that the rules that are notified and published are actually being complied with, and better mechanisms to ensure the neutrality of competition, which includes perhaps modified trade remedies, but there are other mechanisms as well. Hamid's already addressed a little bit special and differential treatment, because obviously we recognize that many developing countries need to have some flexibility, but we have to move past the idea that we have a one-size-fits-all approach that's based on categorization of economies. And it can no longer really just be about having more policy space and more flexibilities to have lesser commitments for an indefinite period of time. We should look more at trying to have flexibilities that are commensurate with need and connected with support for capacity building, as the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, has already demonstrated a good model for. And I'm actually optimistic on this, especially more so even in recent weeks, because despite the fireworks recently between principally the U.S. and China on the issue, the U.S. clarified again that it's not going to insist that countries relinquish their status as developing, only that they forego special and differential treatment in certain circumstances. And for its part, China has acknowledged again in a recent submission a couple of days ago that the developing countries should themselves take on commitments that are commensurate with their level of development. And with these two principles as a starting point, we can start to move past labels and categories, think more about how we conceive and evaluate reciprocity. And it's not that everybody has to have the exact same agreement, exact same obligations at the exact same time, and focus again, as I said, on developing capacity to comply. And third and final point then, just on dispute settlement, that's obviously on the top of everybody's minds. And how do we put dispute settlement in the service of trade cooperation? The current system's obviously emerged out of a particular set of conditions, and those conditions may not exist anymore. With the changing economic conditions, changing balance of power, technology, and a number of different things, I actually don't think that we can preserve the system as it has operated in the way it has for the last 25 years, at least not without some modification. And for a variety of reasons, the dispute settlement system has become perhaps more judicialized to a degree that is no longer serving trade cooperation as effectively as it did in the early period. So to preserve it, we're likely going to have to restore the balance, and Hamid's already referred to this, the balance between the adjudicative function and the political function of the WTO. And in my mind, this includes three elements. There's the first element that is principally now that is most of the focus of the discussion. It's narrowing and clarifying the mandate of adjudication, and perhaps even excluding some issues from adjudication, or at a minimum requiring that they go first to a political process. And this might have to be the case in issues of national security, models of development, et cetera. There are some issues that just don't lend themselves to being resolved through a win-lose adjudicator process. The second, which doesn't get enough attention, is to strengthen the accountability mechanism. And this starts with trying to figure out how to operationalize the provisions already there for authoritative interpretations or for collective member interpretation, either just on the agreements generally, but also including overriding the results of adjudication that achieve a certain amount of objection. And third, I think we have to change, and this is slightly, I'm probably in a minority in this, and it's a slightly more controversial point, we have to change the culture of the participants in the dispute settlement system, one that acknowledges the narrower mandate of the system and that recognizes the continued importance of political resolution. There has emerged an idea that basically all problems can be solved through adjudication and through a judicialized system, and I just don't think that's going to work in the new world. So obviously, as everybody has said throughout the whole day, that this is a pivotal moment for the global economy and for the rules-based trading system. Kazakhstan has an opportunity, but also a fairly large burden. Decisions that are not going to be the end, but as Hamid said, to be the beginning, will set the course for hopefully the revitalization of trade cooperation for many years. I've provided a few areas where we can talk about the architecture of trade, and others have provided many more possibilities. Also, others have said that while we're concerned about disruption, and the disruption is worrying, the reality is that the current system has evolved through disruption and crisis. Mark set out a number of examples in history where it came to a crisis point and we made leaps forward, and it's cause for optimism that the current crisis can lead to another leap forward once we work through all the issues. We don't need to fear change, and I think a lot of it right now, when we highlight particular kinds of crises, it's because we're fearing the process of change. And instead, we should try to embrace it and take the opportunity to update the institutions and the rules for the trading system so that they can contribute to inclusive trade and sustainable prosperity. Thank you. And I didn't meet my objective.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that. I would like to ask the audience if it is okay to finish the panel now without questions. Is that all right? It looks like. Thank you very much. We are sorry for that. My only conclusion is that you definitely deserve a big round of applause again.